The Raspberry Pi GPIO can be confusing. Some pins have duplicate purposes, and there are multiple ways the pins are numbered. And some Raspberry Pis have a different number of pins. Making sense of these pins requires a chart called a pinout, and fortunately, there are several available. Hi, I'm Mark Neiman Ross, and welcome to this week's edition of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Every week, we explore the Raspberry Pi and share useful tips. There are 4 pinout charts you should know about. Let's start with pinout.xyz. This website contains an encyclopedia of information about the GPIO and each individual pin. It shows pins related to several interfaces, and in the notes field it includes technical descriptions of interfaces such as SPI or I2C and describes each pin. It also shows pinouts for a number of hats. It's accurate and complete, but takes a bit of knowledge to understand what it's talking about. For example, if you've never built a circuit using I2C, the pinout.xyz references to I2C may not make a lot of sense. Next is the LinkedIn Learning pinout chart included with the exercise files for this course. This printable chart includes the function of each pin and the identification of each pin for each numbering scheme, including wiring pi, BCM, and board numbers. The pin functions only have names, not descriptions, but it's a good quick reference to have on your workbench. Next is GPIO Read All. This is a command to be run in the terminal window. It produces a snapshot of the state of the GPIO. It's very similar to the LinkedIn Learning chart, but contains 3 additional pieces of information. First, it identifies the Raspberry Pi model. Second, it identifies the name of each pin. Third, it identifies the current mode of each pin, whether it's in or out or on or off. GPIO readout is useful for debugging the signals coming from the Raspberry Pi. Finally, the pinout command provided by GPIO 0. To run this, type pinout at a Raspberry Pi terminal window. It produces a chart with information similar to the LinkedIn Learning printed chart, but specific for the Raspberry Pi it is run on. At the top of the pinout readout, you see a graphic of the Raspberry Pi model that we're running on, including position of the USB ports, the HDMI ports, and other components of the board. Below that is information about the board, such as revision, the amount of RAM, number of USB ports, whether it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and then below that is a pinout of the GPIO. Unlike the LinkedIn Learning chart, this only lists the board numbers of the pin. It does not list the BCM numbers. As you work on the Raspberry Pi, one of these tools will be closest to your way of thinking. Take time to experiment with each and decide which is most useful. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Be sure to join the LinkedIn group and check out previous episodes on LinkedIn Learning. I'll see you next week with more Raspberry Pi adventures.